Let's look at this video right here that was put out by Timcast. Put up 3 weeks ago, has 85,000 views. Tim Pool discusses with 4 other people about whether or not the 10 Commandments should be in public schools. First off, I'll say that this is a panel discussion, and I'm not trying to clout chase or pick low-hanging fruit here. I've been on streams before where there are too many cooks in the kitchen, like we're going to see here, and a lot of times in discussions like this, it can be hard to get in a word. It can be easy to miss stuff that is said, and by the time you're ready to address a disagreement, the conversation has already moved on so fast that you're already on a different topic within the topic. Sometimes you just get a bad case of the stairway wit. We've all been there before, so I'm going to try not to be too harsh, but nonetheless, there was a lot of stuff said that I think is worth addressing. So let's check it out.
From timcast.com, Texas passes legislation requiring 10 commandments to be displayed in every classroom. The bill's sponsor says the 10 commandments are part of American tradition. Under SB 15115, which just passed
the 10 commandments are part of American tradition. How so?
The Senate by a 17-12 vote, every public elementary or secondary school must prominently display a durable copy or framed copy of the 10 commandments that is at least 16 inches wide and 20 inches tall. The display must also be legible to a person with average vision from anywhere in the classroom. The bill.
Why not do this with stuff like the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence, or mandate that kids read the Federalist Papers and really understand the founding ideas of America?
Bill's sponsor, State Senator Phil King, said during a committee hearing on the bill that the 10 Commandments are part of American heritage and that it's time to bring them back into U.S. schools. Oh, boy.
Wait, this is like, there is no other God before me, no false idols. I mean, the second commandment basically says that Christianity is blasphemous. You're not supposed to worship people.
Are they worshiping people?
Well, the Christians worship a human. And the second commandment of the
you are incorrect.
That's incorrect.
Yeah, it's incorrect.
Yeah, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, whether it's a human or a thing. You don't worship other people.
Jesus was not a
God.
human. Yeah.
Well, that's what they say. Yeah, they say he's a human that was also God. They
but
put
at
him
the
on a
same
pedestal.
time,
So
the hypostatic nature.
Exactly. It
The
defies the second commandment. You're not
No,
supposed
it
to worship other people.
No, but he's
it doesn't.
God. He is fully God and fully human at the same time. So you worship fully God. Like it's the word for it is hypostatic union, because you cannot separate the two. So worshiping Jesus.
If I'm being honest, this does sound like a logical contradiction.
I'm Catholic, that's why I know this. Worshiping Jesus, you are worshiping God. He is the Son of God. He is part of the Trinity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all one, 3 in 1. So it's not worshiping a person; it is worshiping God.
It's worshiping a person, God, and the Spirit all at once. So it is a person.
No.
Ian,
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all three. All three. It's 3 in 1. It's the Trinity. It is God. God took the form of a man to come to earth as Jesus Christ, but it's not separated. It's not like, oh, his body was human and his.
Now, isn't this the beauty of mysticism? I don't really care to get too bogged down on this debate, but isn't this the beauty of mysticism, that if you ever come across a contradiction, if you come across conflicting ideas or are confused about something, it could just be explained as, well, God did it. God works in mysterious ways.
Spirit was God. He was both.
I mean, the laws of logic don't apply to God. I mean, he's God. Let's be real here.
Fully God and fully man. So worshiping Jesus is worshiping God.
And I don't want to.
Yeah, this is actually.
I want to talk about the.
This is a whole different podcast.
I want to talk about the political and philosophical.
Let's do it. This is
first,
wild.
for those that I think we should tell you what the 10 Commandments are, so you can understand what they want to put in schools.
I love the first one.
1, no other gods before me. You shall have no other gods before me. 2, you shall not make for yourself a carved image. Is that...
And I also want to make something clear. I'm not really that worried about this, in the sense that I think this will probably get reversed by a court of some sort in the United States.
no false idols, I believe?
Yeah.
3 is, you shall not take the name of your Lord God in vain. Now, this one's interesting because what was explained to me, I think this was Prager who explained this, that a lot of people think it means you can't just say something like, oh my God, because you're using it for no reason. But what he described, I could be wrong about if it was him or not, but someone described it as, it would be like declaring war on an enemy country and saying God wills it.
Yes.
You are taking his name to do your bidding, and that's taking his name in vain.
Oh my gosh, these
It's
super
also-
churches make me think
It's
that.
also like, the phrase Lord?
Yeah.
Lord is actually like not the name of God. But in the Old Testament,
So does that apply to imposing your religion on other people?
the Jewish people, God's people, believed that they couldn't say the name. Actually, Jews today still like abbreviate when they say God. They put a little dash between it because they couldn't say the name of God, which is Yahweh. So it was 4 letters, Yahweh, and so they called it Lord as a way of saying it without saying the name of God, because has such extreme majesty that they couldn't say the name.
Let's read some more. Because again, I'm not here to teach you the 10 Commandments, everybody, but for the context of...
I'll do that, Tim.
This is what they want to put in the schools. You should know this. 4 is remember the Sabbath day. 5 is honor your father and mother. 6, you shall not murder. 7, you shall not commit adultery. 8, you shall not steal. 9, you shall not bear false witness. 10, you shall not covet. So this is being passed in Texas. They want this in elementary schools. I guess the question is, if they're putting critical race theory, critical theory, gender ideology in schools, personally, I don't see any difference. And so my response is going to be, if you are trying to pass Marxism into schools, then okay, fine, you do that, they do this. What am I arguing?
So it is interesting. Tim is not wrong to note that this is not different than some form of left-wing indoctrination, but pay attention to where he goes from here.
Can I tell you my super based opinion on this?
Sure.
Okay, my super based opinion on this is that this is fabulous and that they should do it.
Blow
and
it
that
out
it violates nothing about our heritage of law here.
Heritage of law.
So truly in the conservative movement, the Republican Party, there's a difference between how we view laws, right? There's like the libertarian view that's like, we should be able to do whatever we want as long as we don't violate somebody else's fundamental human right. Government should get off my lawn. And then actual conservatism is not...
By the way, I want to make something else clear. I actually really appreciate Liz Wheeler on this panel. I think she's really bringing out what a lot of conservatives, particularly the religious conservatives, are all about. And while I'm not a libertarian either, I'm neither a conservative or a libertarian, I think it is pretty telling right here. She's making it clear that the conservative movement is not really about freedom or individual rights.
Actual conservatism is like in the style of Edmund Burke, right? Where it's not absolute liberty, it's ordered liberty. Ordered liberty being defined as more like the pursuit of justice. And he defines justice, because you're like, okay, well, what's justice? Then he defines justice as original justice, capital O, original justice, meaning rooted in the traditional Judeo-Christian morality.
Judeo-Christian morality. Already starting off with that nice package deal.
And this is not just something like, oh, okay, I'm a practicing Catholic, I'm coming in here with my religious views. Edmund Burke's philosophy is what our Constitution was based on.
Yeah, just Edmund Burke.
James Madison, the father of our Constitution, quoted Edmund Burke.
Yeah, it was just Edmund Burke. She's leaving out other thinkers, of course, like John Locke and Francis Bacon and Newton and Montesquieu and Thomas Paine. It's also interesting that she doesn't mention, like, if you read the Federalist Papers, from what I remember from them, I don't remember any mention of the Bible or the 10 Commandments or any of that stuff. It's interesting that she goes to Edmund Burke, because I don't think the Founding Fathers were exactly inspired by the Bible or by religion. So I just find all of that interesting.
So my belief is that indoctrination is morally neutral. It's not good or bad in and of itself.
I agree.
Yeah, it's neutral in the same way that eating is neutral. Obviously, you need to eat some food to survive. Of course, you could if you eat poison, then you'll die. Same thing with indoctrination. Yeah, some form, if you have a positive worldview, it can be pretty good, but a lot of ideas are really bad, as we know.
And there's no such thing as neutrality. Either we are going to be indoctrinating or they are going to be indoctrinating. So if we don't have this in schools, then Marxism, which I would argue is a form of like satanic ideology, then...
I wonder what she means by that. She thinks Marxism is a satanic ideology. Is she just using it as like a layman's term to say it's evil, or does she think that like Karl Marx was spoken to by some mysterious demon or dark force or some shit? Who the hell knows?
And Marxism is going to be in our school, so I would much rather have this.
Do you agree with Ten Commandments in schools?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, there is an argument. So I think people misinterpret how America treats religion, right? In France, you have freedom.
And also notice that public education, I'll get more into this later, but public education is just accepted as a given. That whole aspect is not questioned, but I'm over here wondering, is it possible to educate kids without indoctrinating? Like, is it possible to teach kids stuff like math, reading, writing, and science without bringing in Marxist nonsense or religion or whatever? And I did a whole video about this a couple years ago, talking about this anti-racist math curriculum that some states were exploring. I remember they were talking about how, focusing on getting the correct answer is a sign of white supremacy, which is just... But this is the false dichotomy that this panel is setting up. It's either Marxism or it's religion. It's Judeo-Christian values. Why can't you, like last time I checked, you can apply the Pythagorean theorem without any mention of Jesus or some dictatorship of the proletariat. Or even something like physical education or home economics. Like, does the Bible have some sort of opinion on stretching muscles or running warm-up laps or whatever? But I guess that's how these people think. Public schools are a given, and indoctrination is inevitable. And it's either going to be Marxism or it's going to be religion. Those are the only two options, apparently.
From religion. So you're not supposed to wear religious symbols in school. There's controversy over hijab, providing kosher meals, things like that. In America, you have the freedom to practice your religion. However, and I think you're completely right, we're actually a nation that's completely intertwined with Christianity, and so it's not wrong to...
We are a nation that is completely intertwined with Christianity. First off, notice the collectivism, not speaking in terms of individuals, just we as a nation. I don't know about you guys, but I'm certainly not intertwined with Christianity. And last time I checked, I live in a country where the government is supposed to protect my right to not be intertwined with Christianity.
Have the Ten Commandments in schools. I mean, you can reference it in a lot of different ways when you're teaching, right? Like, it's also such a fundamental part of our life that, like, when we talk about observing the Sabbath, right? Like, this is a case that the Supreme Court has agreed to take on. You have this postal worker from Pennsylvania who said, I'm a practicing evangelical Christian and I observe the Sabbath on Sundays. And when the U.S. Postal Service started working with Amazon, they said, okay, but our workers have to work on Sunday. And he said, well, I need a religious exemption. And eventually his postal workers where he's based were like, we're going to keep scheduling you for Sundays. We're not going to acknowledge that you need a religious exemption, even though our typical work week does allow for a Sunday Sabbath. They said this is critical to our business, and so therefore we are allowed, two judges went through and said, yeah, they have the right to demand that you work and deny your religious exemption. Well, you have the freedom to practice your religion, right? Like, I think that we are so afraid.
And employers have the freedom to not employ you if you don't show up to work.
Of religion as a country, that we...
If we're afraid of religion, how are we intertwined with it?
Don't learn how to talk about it in a way that's saying, like, you don't have to be a Christian, but you need to understand Christianity to understand the influences it has on our country.
Well, so Ian, yes or no, Ten Commandments in schools?
It depends on how it's taught, because there's a difference between
mounted
teaching...
on the walls. That's what they said.
There's a difference between teaching about Christianity or Judaism. This is Judaism. There's a difference between teaching about Judaism and indoctrinating people to become Jew.
Okay, wait, hold on. Ian, a specific question. They are mounting this. They want this mounted in elementary schools.
No, I don't like it. It needs context. If they're going to teach it, they need to teach about it and not just make people think this is real. You have to be able to choose to believe that this is real.
But all they're doing is putting it on the wall.
Yeah, that's all they're doing.
without context. That makes me
Would Tim Pool be comfortable with them posting quotes from Karl Marx on every wall of every public school?
nervous, man. I don't.
You know, I'm neutral on it. I certainly understand why Christians and Catholics and whatever and many Jewish people probably would be like, yes, this is fantastic. We should have these values instilled to our children.
Would they?
And you're completely right about indoctrination, 100%.
I know, like, one of the key Supreme Court cases that came about in the 60s. I can't remember if it was like prayer in schools, but the case was originally brought by a Jewish parent who did not want that stuff in the school that he was sending his kids to.
I would prefer the Ten Commandments over Marxism. Mm-hmm. So if someone came to me and said, it's one or the other, I'd be like, oh, Ten Commandments all the way.
But the system where they're like, hey, here's a really horrible choice. And you're like, I don't want that. They're like,
by the way, what's wrong with Marxism? And yeah, that's a rhetorical question, because I imagine the proper response is, well, Marxists ultimately want socialism, and socialism is horrible. They want to abolish private property.
That's just not smart.
Well, isn't the public school, isn't that a socialist institution? I think even Marx, if I recall correctly, he calls for public schools in Communist Manifesto. But again, notice how nobody on this panel addresses that elephant in the room. If socialism is so bad and awful, which it is, then why not just say, to hell with public education, to hell with public schools. Let's all get together and agree on that. We need to get rid of public schools. We need to get the government out of education, and then we can let the parents decide. We can let parents and students decide with their own money which schools they want to send their kids to. And you know what? If churches, if they're these wonderful, charitable, benevolent, pro-community institutions that they and their cheerleaders claim them to be, then I think churches, they would offer to educate those who cannot afford to go to private school. They would offer to educate kids who are born into poor families. They'd offer to educate those kids. And the churches, the religious schools, they would be free to put up the Ten Commandments and say, look, if you want to get a free education provided by the generous donors of this institution, then this is what you're going to have to put up with. How about that?
Okay, here's a little bit less horrible choice. Want that one instead? You're like,
and Ian's right here. He's right to bring up the false dichotomy.
Yeah, I guess it's less worse. There doesn't have to be either of them.
This is the compromise.
Exactly.
No, that's what I don't.
Hold on.
Ian's right here.
That's what I don't believe.
This is the compromise.
I don't think there's anything. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We're not talking about the school teaching Bible study. They're actually putting Marxism in.
Yeah, they're just promoting a particular religion in every classroom. It's not Bible study. We're just putting. It's just the taxpayers and the government establishing and promoting a particular worldview that many people may not agree with.
Classroom curriculum and critical race theory and critical gender theory is literally being put into math problems. This is the compromise. We're going to put it on the wall and say no.
I'd like to see the 4 pillars.
So yeah, it's either anti-racist math or Moses math, I guess.
Of Islam posted next.
But our
to it.
country is not based on the 4 pillars of Islam. Our country is literally based on this. Think about our laws against.
You know, Ian brings up a good point. He's like, what if it were Islam? I'm like, well, that's not part of the tradition. And I'm over here wondering, couldn't you say, all this talk about America being founded on Judeo-Christian values? Isn't Islam more established on Judeo-Christian values than the United States of America? Because if you read the Karen, and yes, I know a lot of people call it the Quran. I call it the Karen because, let's be real, Islamamia is basically one big Karen trying to tell you how to live your life and complaining to the manager about stuff. But you can even see in this passage right here, it makes references to Abraham and Jacob and Moses and Jesus. It's often considered part of the Abrahamic tradition of monotheistic religions. So, what's the problem with Islam? Isn't it based on or inspired by Judeo-Christian values to the extent that concept is meaningful and not just a package deal.
To homicide. Why do we, as a people, recognize that other human beings deserve protection under the law, but like dogs don't? Or
Because dogs don't have the capacity to reason.
something like that. If you look at morality and think about morality, there's actually no such thing as secular morality.
No such thing as secular morality. So either she's never heard of Ayn Rand and objectivism, or she's full of shit.
Secular morality is just anarchy. It's just the strongest can dominate the weak.
And this is what you often hear from culture warriors on the right. They make it sound like secularism, atheism, and logically just concludes to either anarchy or Marxism.
The only reason that we have order in our country right now, even as we are in a chaotic era, is because we have some acknowledgement at the base level that people have dignity, that people have value, and that order is based on Judeo-Christian values. Now, you don't have to practice
So is Islamia.
those values in your personal life, but it is ahistorical to ignore the fact that our entire system, our entire republic is based on that.
Yeah, is it any different than having a dictionary in the classroom, right? Like if you're explaining, hey, fifth grader, these are what the Bill of Rights are like. Here's something that influenced that. Like, how is having this resource any different, right?
And even if it were true that America drew some inspiration from the Bible, which I think is incredibly exaggerated at best, you would not get that impression by merely seeing the Ten Commandments on the wall. And I'm of the opinion that the Ten Commandments are in conflict with the Bill of Rights in a lot of ways.
Right? Like if you want to talk about how it compares to Islam, then yeah, maybe you should bring in some text so students can study it.
The truth is, I think Judaism is the most based religion. I think it is phenomenal because it's about your religion, your experience with God directly. You don't need a priest. You don't need any of that. It's you and God. I think that is where it all comes from. All of it. Christianity, Islam, it all comes from Judaism.
Oh, so we even have Ian over here saying, yeah, Islam, it comes from Judaism.
I'm following the founding fathers.
At least built on the foundation.
Saying church and state should be separate.
I don't think they ever said that.
That was only in one letter that Thomas
It was just one letter.
Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists to assure them that they weren't going to face discrimination from the government for practicing their religion. But the phrase separation of church and state was never part of any founding document, and it's
neither were the Ten Commandments or the Bible.
Not part of any philosophy about keeping morality out of law. It's only about whether the government can either force you to participate in religious practice or prohibit it.
And I'm pretty sure there was also, conversely, a founding father, maybe it was Franklin or Jefferson, that said you need religion for a society to function properly.
Yeah, where did John Adams say that? I think
John Adams said our country was made for moral people and no other.
Yes,
which was again said in a letter. I have had to point this out before. They'll dismiss the separation of church and state as, oh, Thomas Jefferson just mentioned it in a letter. Yet John Adams quotes that America was meant for a moral and religious people, also written in a letter. How convenient.
See the churches capitalizing on religion. That really bothers me.
He's right, though. We talk about this all the time. So the question I've asked is, would the United States be better? Or someone asked us this, would the country be better if it was a Christian theocracy?
I would say...
And first of all, better, I guess, is subjective. But if you were to talk about, do we want less crime? Do we want a stronger economy? Do we want better health care? If everybody shared the same moral foundations, everyone's lives would be better. However,
Is that the case if everyone shared the same moral foundations?
I'm not saying which moral foundations. I'm just saying if you had 100 million people that all agreed communism was perfect, guess what? It would work.
No, it wouldn't.
The reality is communism doesn't work because no one ever agrees to that great extent.
The reason why communism does not work is because the reason why communism is always a disaster is because fundamentally it rejects reason and individualism, and likewise politically it denies humans the ability to think for themselves and to use their mind to put to productive use and freely trade with one another. By the way, you can apply the same logic to any religion.
Someone's always got to run a system or whatever. That's why communism doesn't
Tim's logic, that is.
work. But if everybody had a simple moral foundation that was like the Ten Commandments or otherwise, everybody agreed that there was an afterlife, there was a God, we have to be good stewards of the earth and all that, you'd have to worry a lot less about crime.
Is that true? If people were more religious and shared the same value, there would be less crime. Are we sure about that? Doesn't Mexico have a much higher crime rate than much of the United States while also being more religious? Aren't a lot of European countries and countries like Japan, aren't they less religious than the United States and have lower crime rates? I guess on the other hand, you could point to a country like Saudi Arabia, which I think has pretty low crime rates, but is also much more religious. I think there's a lot more nuance to that question, though, to say the least.
The issue is, right now...
And you could say, when thinking about Saudi Arabia, like, yeah, maybe you're less likely to get your house burglarized or your pocket picketed, your wallet stolen or whatever. But you're also much more likely to get flogged for saying blasphemous things.
No one believes or fears that there is any consequence to the bad things they do.
Or even if you're falsely accused of stealing, you might get your hand chopped off, which is irreversible.
We experience more crime and corruption.
Were you taught religion as a kid?
Yes, yeah, I was raised in a Catholic home, and then of course you get to an age as a young adult where you have to decide, like, okay, am I going to continue in this practice as an adult and own it versus just participate in a family? One more point about this being in schools, though, and this is really interesting if you read the history of public schools in our country. Compulsory public schooling only became a thing in, like, I think Massachusetts was the first state to do it in 1836, and the reason that they did that, the reason that they had compulsory public schooling was to indoctrinate children in two things: in American values.
In American values.
And in Protestant values.
And Protestant values? I thought they were the same thing.
At that time in our country, there were tons of immigrants coming in our country. A lot of them were Catholic immigrants.
Oh, really?
And the people in charge of our government at the time were very anti-Catholic. They were very Protestant.
Why were they anti-Catholic? Isn't Catholicism, isn't it part of the whole Judeo-Christian umbrella?
And they wanted to form...
Why would, you're talking about, the heritage of America being Christian. Why would politicians in the 19th century America be hostile to Catholics then?
A new generation of children that understood that they shouldn't identify as the country that they came from. They needed to identify as American. So they had to be taught American civics, and they wanted them taught Protestant values. So the purpose of
It's almost as if American values and Judeo-Christian values are not necessarily the same thing.
Our education system has actually always been indoctrination. It was just hijacked by people who wanted to indoctrinate the opposite of what it was intended to.
So I did look into this a little bit, and one of the sources I found this article on Pew Research. It's called "Religion in Public Schools." I guess it was put up on October 28th of 2021. It looks like, or was that a link to another article? I don't know. Oh, October 3rd, 2019. Oops. But here's something that really got me interested. Article on Pew Research talks about how conflicts over religion in school are hardly new. In the 19th century, Protestants and Catholics frequently fought over Bible reading and prayer in public schools. The disputes then were over which Bible and which prayers were appropriate to use in the classroom. Some Catholics were troubled that the school's reading materials included the King James Version of the Bible, which was favored by Protestants. In 1844, fighting broke out between Protestants and Catholics in Philadelphia. A number of people died in the violence, and several Catholic churches were burned. It's odd because don't all these people, don't they share the same value system? Judeo-Christian values, and you'd think there'd be less crime. You wouldn't think there'd be all this burning of churches and people getting killed over which interpretation of the Bible and the Ten Commandments or the prayers or whatever would be enforced in public schools. Similar conflicts erupted during the 1850s in Boston and other parts of New England. In the early 20th century, liberal Protestants and their secular allies battled religious conservatives over whether students in biology classes should be taught Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And by the way, I think this is a reason why even a lot of religious people don't want any of this crap. A lot of religious people, a lot of Christians in America are not really on board with all this theocracy talk. And I think another reason, I think it might be mostly the fact that the American in them keeps them from wanting to impose their religion and their beliefs on others. But I think even a lot of religious people know and understand that this kind of stuff can get really ugly really quick. I think a lot of religious people, they're well aware of disagreements between different sects of Christianity, different sects of religion, different interpretation of the Bible and of the Ten Commandments. And I think they're well aware that there's a good chance that their interpretation of Scripture will not be the one that wins out. And even if it is, it will get ugly really quick. And it's probably best for everyone that we keep church and state separate. But all this got me thinking when I was looking into this, and I'm going to be speaking broadly here. I'm not focusing on, I'm going to be focusing on the conservative movement and not Liz Wheeler or anyone else on this panel on Timcast. But seeing this got me looking into the history of the First Amendment and stuff like blasphemy laws and religion in public schools and all of that fun stuff. Because I've heard similar sentiment over the years from people like Bent Shapiro and Michael Knowles about how parts of the United States used to have blasphemy laws and obscenity laws, and that the First Amendment, well, it was originally meant for the federal government. States and localities, they could suppress speech all they wanted through blasphemy laws, apparently, according to these conservatives. And I've read different scholars on this, and I've read some that have said no, including, I think I've read one paper from the University of Notre Dame that said no, the Bill of Rights were intended to be applied throughout the Union, and that the Supreme Court dropped the ball on that, hence why we eventually got the 14th Amendment, which incorporated the Bill of Rights to local and state governments. But even putting that aside, when thinking about all this, it really dawned on me that the overriding principle that matters to religious conservatives is religion. It's not the Constitution. It's not the Bill of Rights. It's not the First Amendment. It's not individual rights. You know, consider the fact that whenever pro-abortion advocates would hold up Roe versus Wade, religious conservatives would point out the fact that the Supreme Court has not always gotten things right. They would hold up decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson. They would often hold up Plessy versus Ferguson as a concrete of a bad decision. Plessy happens to be a decision that deals with public education, where the Supreme Courts initially allowed for segregated public schools until we got Brown versus the Board of Education. Yet when it comes to teaching stuff like prayer in schools or posting the Ten Commandments in every public school or preaching religion or mandating school prayer, then these conservatives, then they drop all that nuance. They'll say, well, hey, we have a tradition of religion in public schools. Well, couldn't you say the same about segregation? Would someone like a Liz Wheeler accept going back to segregated schools? Which funny enough, even a lot of the CRT intellectuals like Derek Bell want. Would these religious conservatives or people like Tim Pool, would they accept that because, hey, it was once part of tradition? I sure as hell hope not. Or look at how many conservatives will now today claim that the First Amendment means that a private company cannot tell you to get off, cannot give you the boot. Dennis Prager did this explicitly when he lobbied the government to prevent Google from restricting his Ten Commandments videos. So the First Amendment, I guess, was meant to be applied to Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, but not state governments? That's what I'm supposed to believe from these religious conservatives? Or whenever conservatives talk about, say, Christian bakeries and how they have a religious liberty to not make cakes for a same-sex wedding because, hey, religious liberty. Religious liberty. I'm often told by these conservatives that Americans have religious liberty. But if conservatives, if they ever want to bring back blasphemy laws, then they'll just talk about tradition and not religious liberty. It's okay for a state or a local government to take away, to violate your religious liberty by imposing blasphemy laws or shoving a particular religion down your kid's throat at your socialist-ass public school because, hey, tradition. These people do not give two shits about religious liberty or liberty in general. And again, I actually appreciate Liz Wheeler here because I think she's revealing what religious conservatives truly want. And I think she's revealing that a lot of these so-called abandoned liberals like Tim Pool, who didn't leave the left, but the left left him and he's still a liberal. Well, people like Tim Pool will not stand up to them because, hey, at least it's not the left.
What are you, on the left?
Absolutely pathetic.
The factory workers,
do this.
that was like Rockefeller.
Let me ask you guys. I want to read the commandments and then get your opinions on it. So because they want to teach kids this. Let me ask you all first. Obviously, I think the Christians in the room are going to have an obvious answer. No other gods before me. You shall have no other gods before me. Is that something a children should be taught in general?
This one makes me nervous because if I say to you, Tim, there is no other God before me, and I'm reading you the commandment, there can be a possibility that you think that it's Ian. There's no other God before the ego that is speaking the words. So that one gets misinterpreted when the guy stands up and says it out loud. It's true that there is one God, but it is not it's not me. It's God is speaking through us.
I think it's unlikely that people would misinterpret it like
I think
But
that
hold
priests
on.
stand
So
up.
one of the endorsers of this saying, it's unlikely that someone would misinterpret it like that. Maybe she's right, but it is worth noting again that there's a lot of different interpretations on, even between Christians, on how the Bible should be taught and interpreted. A lot of disagreements over that.
Up and take the credit for a lot of stuff. They
that's not
become
my
the
question.
one.
No,
They're like,
because they read
that's
from
not
the
my
Bible.
that's not my question. My question is, is it a good thing to teach a child about the one God?
No.
I'm not saying to.
Now, if you want to do it in your private life, if you want to go to church and take your kids to church, then fine. But on the taxpayer dime in public schools, absolutely not.
Accidentally say to a kid a sentence and then walk away. I'm saying, should an adult be telling a children basic philosophies around?
And I'd highly recommend reading Ayn Rand's essay. I think it was on the student rebellion in Return to the Primitive, where she talks about how this is ultimately an impossible issue to solve. She was more talking about the issue of public property, especially at universities like Berkeley.
The First Amendment. Yes.
Depends on the teacher.
First commandment. You said First
Okay.
Amendment.
Sorry.
First commandment.
First Amendment.
But hey,
Yes, the
man,
amendment.
they crafted the 10 amendments. You know, the 10 Bill of Rights is kind of like a.
I think part of it is
Ten
like,
Commandments.
yes, as a Christian, I think sounds good to me. And I can understand in a diverse society where there are different religious views, you might be concerned, like seeing there's only one Christian God, does that isolate someone else? But I think the idea behind this, meaning that there is one point of authority, there's one point of morality, is a good concept to teach people, right?
It can make them subservient to authority, so you got to be careful about that. If I was a kid and I saw that on the wall and I didn't know what it meant, first thing I would ask is, what is God?
But but to clarify, I get it. But I'm trying to clarify. I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying, should children be taught that there is one God and no other God?
Are you talking about by public schools or in general? Should
In
children-
general.
Oh,
I would ask why they should be taught that.
children have that? Absolutely, yes.
It's
Ian,
it needs to be
it's
more than
truth.
that because
It's the
it's both
truth.
one and many, and it's what is it, and you got to explain what it is.
Well, it's never going to be taught in
I'm
isolation.
asking you, Ian, if they should.
So it sounds like Liz Wheeler wants somewhat of a slippery slope here. We'll start here, and then, we're not going to teach in isolation. Then we can start bringing in, Bible study and whatnot.
Teach that
in school.
No, in general.
Oh, well, yeah, I think so. That's what I like to do that. I think
Because
it's our job.
they could also teach polytheism. They could say
Which we
that-
should. Yeah.
No, I'm saying they go to children and say, "Did you know that Zeus is atop Mount Olympus?" And
Zeus
he
was
is-
a guy that had electricity, and he lied to people and told them he could shoot lightning. And he had sex with
believe
his
that.
kids.
Yeah, why not establish Zeus as a god? Why not?
Nut job. They're a big cult living up in the mountains.
That's a 20, Ian. That's a 20.
Zeus.
So here's the next one.
Sorry, I can't get over it.
Should children in general be told not to worship false idols?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I
Yes.
completely agree. I think you
Especially in
agree
our
too. That
culture
was
of,
the
like-
So
point.
it's okay to worship a god that they might not even know is real, but worshiping idols is bad?
Point of your first.
Materialism
And
and this
influencer culture?
self-love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did you guys catch what Liz Wheeler just said there?
Completely agree. I think you
Especially in
agree
our
too. That
culture
was
of,
the
like,
Especially in our culture of materialism and self-love, she's going to say.
point of your first.
materialism
And
this
influencer culture?
self-love.
Yeah.
For sure.
Now, she has a point about materialism, but self-love? And obviously not in some superficial way, but isn't it good to love yourself? Do you want to reach a point where you love yourself, love what you're doing, proud of your achievements, and are happy with what you've done?
Sure.
Everyone agrees.
Yeah. Yeah, but only in conjunction with the first, because you need to know what to worship.
Exactly. And then it actually says that. It says the first and second commandments go hand in hand. I think the second commandment is actually not even necessarily a Christian. It doesn't need to be seen as a Christian specific thing.
And here we have Tim trying to imprint somewhat of a secular meaning onto this.
Telling people not to worship false idols, I think, is a good thing.
Jewish. It's a
Just
Jewish
a-
thing. These are all Jewish.
Yeah. So we all agree with that. And I'll just say, I think it's because there are bad things that will try to trick you and deceive you, and you could be tricked into worshiping bad things. We're trying to say,
But that wouldn't apply to the Old Testament?
hey, be careful of those who would trick you into worshiping
Money. Do
e-
not worship it.
bad politicians.
I mean, I
Like-
got to interject here
Seriously.
and say that as a Catholic, we look at the Bible as a whole, not just line by line. Like everything is contextualized, both with the Old Covenant and then the fulfillment, the New Covenant and the Gospels. So it's not just good advice for your life. It all centers
Yeah, it's not just about good advice for your life.
around the fact that God has given us these laws in order for us to better worship Him, and ultimately, and this is
Yeah, that's what it's all about. Especially from my understanding, this is a big reason why I've been reading the Bible at least once a week since October on Twitch, so I can get a better understanding of this, of the kind of world that the Liz Wheelers want to bring about. And she's totally honest about all this. Like, yeah, like the whole point of this, you know, the 10 Commandments, all of the commandments, that's what they are. They're commandments. It's not helpful life advice. It's not friendly suggestions on how to live a better, happier life. It's pretty clear in the Bible that, God, he frequently talks like a mafia boss, right? He frequently talks about the Israelites and people in general as if they owe him something, right? Constantly. Hey, remember that time I led you guys out of Egypt? I led you guys out of slavery. You guys remember that? You remember that? You remember that? You remember that? Well, now you owe me something. Remember when I gave you some nice land? Remember when I told you to go destroy all these civilizations for worshiping false idols so that you can take their land for yourself, your land, my promised land for you? Remember that? Well, now you have to obey my commands. Oh, by the way, if you don't obey my commands, then who knows? Maybe some bad things may happen. You might get a plague. You might get some nasty diseases. You might get some natural disasters. You might get conquered by your neighbors. Who knows? I might just let that happen because, hey, you did not obey my commands. And we have Liz Wheeler really clarifying that. You really got to appreciate this stuff.
I know the religious point of view, but it's not just secular advice for your life.
Exactly. It's not secular advice for your life.
I think that's an actual component. I think these are to help you actually live a better, happy, and more fulfilling life.
Nope.
If I were
But
to,
how do you define those words?
Yeah, again, Tim Pool is trying to imprint some sort of secular meaning into this when it's just not there. And the people who want this in schools, like Liz Wheeler, they're making it clear that it's not about that.
Better, happier, and more fulfilling. Do you define those as like just here on Earth, or do you define that like, okay, well,
saying it's both.
on Earth, your goal is actually keeping your eyes on eternity to live this life so that you can get to the next.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it's all about. You live this life so you can get to the next life.
I will say, if your view is that this is to better worship God, that is true and correct. And I would also say, if you follow them, your life will be better in general.
And
Yeah,
if you're
that's fine.
if you're
I'll
tripping
agree
on
with that.
DMT and you know this stuff, you'll be better off while you're tripping.
So this next one's 3 is interesting. It's funny that we're actually discussing the philosophy.
Notice none of the commandments say, they don't command you to like really think about your long-term values and happiness and try to live a good life. I don't know where Tim gets that.
To the 10 Commandments. I'm actually really excited for this. You shall not take the name of your Lord God in vain. I'm going to start this one because I am not Christian. I do believe in God. And my view is, call it whatever you want, call it superstitious or spiritual. I am very reluctant to curse or tempt the fates. I have had many instances in my life where I don't know how you describe it. I wouldn't necessarily say it's using the Lord's name in vain, but arrogance, and then I had the pie thrown in my face, where I've made jokes thinking, who cares, and then experienced a thing. I've had experiences in my life where I've sat behind my computer and mocked someone just to myself, and then a week later met them, and they were the nicest person in the world to me, just ripping my heart out. And I'm like, I can't believe I would think those things about this person. That was the stupidest thing. So I look at this, I'm like, call it whatever you want. I believe there is something greater than us, and I believe insulting the universe, the greater, the energy, or God, or that is just, I stay away from that. I think it's a bad thing. I think you will be better off if you remain humble.
Dude,
And
also
accept that there are powers beyond you.
like I think God speaks to people. I have when I clear my mind and I ask, tell me what to do. I get a vision of what I'm doing. But if I went online and said, God commands you to subscribe to me for $10 a month, like that's the vein. That's the
Absolutely.
That never that you need to follow that commandment.
Sure.
You do not abuse that thing.
I think that's one interpretation
Yeah,
of the
agreed.
word vain. I think the other part is saying that, like, you have to set boundaries for yourself on what you're allowed to say, like being able to basically understand what's inappropriate, what's not appropriate. You are able to better understand respect. Like, this is basically the concept of respecting something that has more authority and knowledge than you do, right? And like that is
What has more authority and knowledge than me, though, in this context?
actually a
Is it God?
good principle to carry out in life.
So I'm
It's
just
like the principle of salvation, really. It's like the ultimate humility because we are not worthy of even saying his name,
Yeah, we're not worthy.
let alone living forever with him in eternity and
Yeah.
experiencing his love, right?
I think
Humans aren't worthy of love.
Except for that he came to save us.
to kind of
I guess except God's love. Or it's God's love that humans are not worthy of.
simplify why I wanted to go through these as they're talking about putting it in schools is that we need to teach basic philosophy. I think
What kind of philosophy?
the idea that people say we are moist robots and there is nothing beyond life, I'm like, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Like any degree of scientific understanding, philosophical understanding, and spiritual general knowledge, like I'm saying, if you're not a Christian and you just read the Bible to better understand what people think, all of these things would lead, I think, any person who is an open mind and is actually trying to learn, they would be like, there is something truly beyond us.
It's not what I got.
At the very
Then again, I'm only on the Book of Chronicles so far, but not once have I thought, and I try to read it with an open mind. I try to be fair, and there have been points and times where I say, you know what, this part's good. Or I point out a part where I'm like, oh, I can see why someone would think that eventually led to this part of the Constitution. Mostly the part about like judges being impartial when judging disagreements and stuff, but really that's about it. But I try to be fair, but reading it with an open mind, the impression I get is that human beings were created by this all-knowing, all-powerful creator, and if we don't follow his commands, then bad things will happen.
least. And so you got to teach kids philosophy. I think these are all really great. To
This
be
could
honest.
go in a science class because
I mean, even Moses was not allowed into the promised land for the simple error of not banging a rock with a stick to get water out of it.
talking about quantum physics. I mean, then
Well, let's read. Look, remember the Sabbath day. I'm fairly neutral on this. I mean, I think a day off is very important, a day of rest. I think it means something else to Christians.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, the Sabbath is really about like meditating
Family.
on your family,
So
meditating
it's about meditating.
on the philosophy of the things that you've learned. Like, I think that the Sabbath day is something our culture doesn't appreciate because we just see it as the day before Monday.
I'm going to stop right there and say, you know what? Probably the most important commandment, and I think everybody should
Most important commandment.
be taught it. My view is that it is not some arbitrary thing about God's day necessarily. It is.
Oh, it's not about God's day, huh? Wait for this.
We talk about Shabbat and how Jewish families from sundown on Friday until sundown on Saturday turn off all the devices, come together and be a family. That is one of the most powerful cultural tools in human arsenal.
I was sitting in front of my computer the other night, and I just heard this frequency in my head, like bam, 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 bam. And I was like, "What is that noise? That's my blood pressure." And when my monitor dimmed, it stopped. Like these machines are driving our minds.
Probably affecting us in ways we don't know. But my point is, remembering the Sabbath. One of the things that's breaking apart Western civilization is that we don't congregate with our families and our communities anymore.
Yeah, and to your point,
And
like,
that's what the Sabbath was.
Christian communities, right, used to go to church together with your family, with your community. Then you'd go home and you weren't allowed to work, and you're supposed to be talking to each other and thinking about the lessons that you are being taught in church through interpretation through your pastor or whatever else.
That's
Like,
what
it is about the moral growth of both your family and of the individual.
It's
And
also the idea of dedicating that day to God. Like, it's I agree with what you're saying, that the degradation of our society is because of the breakdown of the family and the fact that even when families are
And
together,
here's Liz Wheeler bringing it back to fundamentals.
we're all on the devices that wreck our brains. But that commandment, the interpretation of that commandment, is to dedicate that day to God.
Yeah, it's to dedicate that day to God.
That, like,
Not this secular mumbo jumbo that everyone's trying to, oh, well, actually, this is good for Western civilization and it's good for family values. And Liz Wheeler's like, no. I agree with that sentiment, but let's be real. The Sabbath, it's all about dedicating that day to God. And if you read the book of Numbers, I wonder if Tim got that impression when he read the book of Numbers and saw that Moses, after talking to God, he sentenced a man to death by stoning for gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And Tim probably thought, there's something bigger in this universe than me.
like I go to mass every Sunday because I go to mass to worship God the way that he laid out that he wants to be worshiped.
Yeah.
Right?
It's not for Western civilization.
And that's what it means to say, okay, that day is your day. It's not about me. It's not about my rest. It's not about my enrichment. It's about you.
Yeah, it's not about your enrichment. It's about God.
And so I will stop everything I'm doing and worship you.
And I think
There's no question about any of the other commandments. I think there's literally no argument. Honor your father and your mother.
Big time.
It is. I'm sorry, if you don't honor your father.
And as far as it being the most important commandment, I mean, I was thinking thou shalt not murder would probably be a bigger one. But if we're thinking logically about the Bible as much as we can, I think the first one is obviously the most important because without the first one, none of the others matter, really. Because again, these aren't about it's not like helpful advice for you to live a good life. There's one God, and he created the universe and created life, and this is where morality comes from. So this is why all the other commandments are good. If you disregard the first one, if that's not the most important, then the rest don't really matter.